Hey Matt, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be back with you.
Yes, good to be back with you. It's been a while. Is the weather lifted at all in D.C.? Because it has been really just god-awful here for the last, week.
It's bad. It's like the worst April ever. You're in Boston, right?
I'm in Boston, but I mean, this is the first year we've lived here for a while. In Chicago, you always knew the April sucked because April was right around the time that you were looking forward to spring happening, and of course, being in Chicago, it never actually happened.
Right.
But,
it definitely snowed in April one time when I was in college in Boston.
Right.
So.
My memory about Boston is that you would get reasonably warm weather, and then it would snow once or twice. But then it would quickly go away. On the other hand, the sort of persistent cold rain, this is a little unusual, I think.
No, it's bad. I kind of think the oil companies have tried to just, put a damper on global warming talk.
Yes, that's true. It's been interesting. All the now it's the cold. Although unless it's a day after tomorrow scenario, maybe that'll happen.
No, sure, right. But I mean, they're stamping on, I don't know if you've seen, I think it's the Vanity Fair or something, has Leonardo DiCaprio on a polar bear out there as their current issue. But, because I guess global warming kills polar bears.
Yes, it does.
But wait, this is not one of our official topics.
Yes. Speaking of killing people, unfortunately. That was in really bad taste.
All right, no, I apologize for laughing at that joke.
To
the readers
it brings up it brings up the Virginia Tech shootings, and a question that I'm going to try to phrase this. I mean, it's a tragedy, and we're already starting to see debates about gun control and about other issues, improving campus security and so on and so forth. The concern I have on all these things is whether or not, from isolated events like this, from relatively rare events like this, you wind up trying to, craft public policy that, I guess, overreacts. In other words, trying to think about this in the middle of a trauma is just not going to generate anything of use. And the point I was trying to make when I was blogging about this is that I'm not sure there's anything I can add or anyone else can add to the fact that this is just a tragedy.
Right, yeah, I said something about this on my site, which is that, I don't have a problem with the idea of trying to use a story in the headlines, even if it's a tragic story, to, advance some kind of policy aims, if they're good aims. But that, I think sometimes something will happen, like when John Corzine gets in a car accident, where his injuries seem to have been worse than they would have been had he been wearing a seatbelt, right? That actually
and not going 91 miles an hour.
Right. Both of those things. But I mean, those are unusually high-profile instances of something that's actually quite common. I mean, people drive too fast. People don't wear their seatbelts. So that kind of using this story to try and push for some kind of changes, right, could really do some good. Whereas, a spree killing on a college campus is horrible, and it's obviously why it becomes such a big story. But it's also really, 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 really rare. I mean, it's just not the case that the United States in general has a substantial campus spree killing problem that needs to be addressed one way or the other.
Yeah. No, that's true, and hopefully that will continue to be the case.
Right.
No, and you're right, because there's a tension here. On the one hand, I mean, if you study, politics, John Kingdon, among others, talks about the idea of, and I blogged about this, talks about the concept of the policy window, which is when you have a crisis or some sort of, news hook, there is naturally an incentive for groups that want to promote public policy to take advantage of the news hook and say, all of this could be solved if we did policy X. And the problem, and I like the point that you make, that, the problem is that there are sometimes events that, are noteworthy because of who it happens to, but they're actually they're typical of a broader variety of a larger category of events. And then there are events that actually in some ways garner much more news attention, but are so garner news attention in part because they're so unbelievably rare.
Right.
And so, you're right. And then the other problem is, I've been talking about this with some other colleagues of mine. The problem is when you have a story like this, you inevitably, there's a New York Times story today about this kid, this 23-year-old, being moody and being, withdrawn.
Right, sure. And there were warning signs. signs.
Right, there were always warning signs. And the warning signs in this case was he wrote disturbing fiction.
Mm-hmm.
He apparently, wore hooded sweatshirts and sunglasses all the time.
Right.
And was generally unresponsive. And my response to the hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses all the time is that therefore all poker players will therefore go on gun sprees by this sort of logic.
No, I mean, right. I mean, I'm not at the moment because I'm on fake television, but while I've been working from home, I'm normally wearing hooded sweatshirts, and I have those
and
glasses.
Sunglasses, really, that's interesting.
And I have glasses that automatically, turn shaded if you walk out in the sun. So I can frequently be seen in a hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses, and to the best of my knowledge, I'm not, on the verge of a spree killing. Precisely
okay, we got
because,
it on record. Good.
Yeah, precisely because, the problem with these kind of warning signs is that, to assess a contention like that, you need to know something about how many false positives are you going to
Exactly.
get,
It's
right?
type 1 versus type 2 error. Yeah.
Right. I mean, how many moody loners are there on the aggregate college campuses of America? I mean, I have no idea, but it's probably a lot.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, most professors encounter this at some point during their career, which is you encounter a student, more than one student who, they just ain't necessarily right. And the problem is that they're unbelievably intense. They're, they're not so, they're socially awkward. The problem is, this actually describes a fair number of college students when they initially come to campus.
Mm-hmm.
And one could actually argue this has been an increasing, this is an interestingly increasing problem. And this is actually something I'm surprised hasn't been talked about nearly as much, which is an increasing number of students are, there's an increasing percentage of college students now that are diagnosed with psychological issues prior to coming on campus. Now, this might be because psychological diagnoses on the whole have gone up, as a secular increase. But I don't
colleges
see anyone
are admitting more crazy people.
Right, yeah, but suddenly, what's interesting is that I don't see anyone saying we need to have stronger filters to prevent crazy, potentially crazy people, from coming onto campus. And that actually is kind of surprising. Instead, what issues I've seen talked about this is mostly the gun control one.
Right. Well, although I've started to see, because it does seem to be a more promising angle in that I read on Kevin Drum's site information that it wasn't just disturbing writing in a generic sense, but it was actually so bad that I think his fellow classmates in some poetry class had refused to attend. I don't know what was in that, but that does sound sort of beyond kind of average angstiness.
No, and it's true. The problem is, and part of this might be because you and I have unfortunately, seen enough of these kinds of stories after Columbine, what have you, where the report is student seemed moody, isolated, withdrawn. It just so according to stereotype that you really don't know what to make of it at that point. I mean, what's the difference between your garden variety, socially awkward, isolated student and the really, really, really disturbed one?
Right. I mean, because even I knew someone in college who seemed moody, isolated, withdrawn, and one day he kind of snapped, and what he did was I think he wrecked his bookshelf. And threw broken pieces of it out the window. Which, I mean, was bad. You shouldn't destroy your own bookshelf. Pieces of wood could have hit some... but it wasn't that
clearly,
bad.
we need to have, government registration of bookshelves from this.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, right. I mean, which is just to say that, I mean, it seems really hard for me to say, if you see someone who's clearly under... having problems and under some kind of, mental pressure or something. I mean... how do you know which of those people are going to be the ones who kill dozens of people versus just, have an irrational outburst of some kind? And it seems horrible to contemplate something like this falling on a spectrum with, I don't know, all other kinds of sort of, acting out behaviors that people do. But the warning signs are just so similar to the warning signs for much more banal kinds of behaviors.
Right, and then, of course, so this is what the costs and benefits are. The cost, the cost of not taking action, not reporting students like this, or seeking, aggressive treatment. And it appears that his name is... Cho Sung-hui, apparently was admitted, did receive treatment in 2005, in part based upon sort of these stories, is that, first of all, the treatment might not work.
Right.
And second, you might be overdiagnosing. You might have students who, they're going through a bad patch, or, they've simply been misinterpreted, and yet they're suddenly, they're either forced to undergo this treatment, which actually could cause them, some sort of backlash, and therefore, paradoxically, you can easily see this kind of intervention actually creating the very behavior you're trying to prevent.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's tough. And what I go back to is, I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but if you look at, how many Americans are killed each and every year in spree killing, mass murders, right?
Yeah.
It's really few people.
Yeah.
It's just not, and so, obviously, one wishes this didn't happen. It would be good to do things to make it less likely around the corner, but it's not systemically a problem of the scale that justifies, I think, doing things that will have significant major costs and burdens on people.
Right.
It's not something whereas, then on the other example, tons and tons and tons of people die in car accidents. Insofar as there are things we can do that would make, 4% decline in the number of automobile fatalities, that would be a huge gain. Whereas,
although correct me if I'm wrong, that figure has actually gone down pretty persistently over the last couple decades.
Right. But precisely because things. There's been real efforts to get there to be airbags and seatbelts in cars and people to wear them and to get people not to drive drunk and so on and so forth. And that's done a huge amount of good. Whereas a comparable precipitous decline in the number of spree killings would actually not save that many people.
Right. I saw an article in Time that suggested that some universities were considering, one way to deal with this was to have, to have key cards that would allow, and I've seen this in campuses, to improve campus security, where only students with ID cards can get into, certain dorms and so on and so forth. And,
right.
There's a part of me, and this is probably a we went to college during different but more than 10 years apart. When I was going to school, we didn't have these kinds of things. And I have to admit, there's a part of me that's very sad that these things exist. But I'm not sure whether or not the benefit, maybe perhaps the benefits outweigh the costs. I'm honestly not sure.
I don't know. When I was in school, we had a key card system like that, so that I could get into, my dorm. And
but you couldn't get into other dorms?
I couldn't get into other. I think it was that I could get into other dorms sort of during daytime, but not at night.
See. Okay.
Right, which seemed it never even occurred to me to think of that as an anti-spree killing measure, but it seemed like a fairly reasonable sort of security-ish thing. Treating the dorms like they were apartment buildings or whatever else, and that if you wanted to sort of come in, you had to have someone who lived there, sort of de facto vouching for you. How much?
Those measures weren't designed to prevent sprees. I assume they were both anti-theft and also anti-rape devices, and God knows that's probably a good idea.
Right, and that all seemed reasonably prudent to me. So on some level, right? If certain college administrators are to use something like this as maybe a pretext for making worthwhile security changes, that's not such a bad thing. For people to sort of just look twice at what it is they're doing, even though this specific problem, is probably not worth overhauling all of your procedures for.
Mm-hmm. I was curious what you thought, by the way, of your colleague, Garance Frankie-Ruda had a post arguing that that the problem with the slow response in the Virginia Tech shootings was a failure to recognize domestic violence as a real issue. I was curious what your take was on that.
Yeah, so, my instinctive reaction to that was that it sounded very, very correct. As Grimes was pointing out, that one of the reasons that the Virginia Tech people sort of cited for why they hadn't put out a wider alert was that they thought that these initial shootings were just a domestic incident. And Grimes was saying, I think persuasively, that, you have to recognize, someone who's just gone and shot his girlfriend, which is what they thought had happened, and then is, in points unknown, is in fact a dangerous, violent person you need to be concerned with. Then someone else pointed out to me that the Virginia Tech campus is actually quite enormous, and that it's not clear to me. Obviously, in retrospect, you wish something had been done, but actually, that no matter how seriously you had taken this initial incident, that, you know, I mean, trying to look at it without the benefit of hindsight, why would you shut down a 2,900-acre campus or whatever it was?
No, it seems to me, I mean, and the other problem is, I mean, as I read it, I don't think the Virginia Tech police, the security was downplaying the first violent incident. It's that they didn't assume, what they didn't assume was, most, issues of domestic violence, cases of domestic violence, don't then escalate into spree-type shootings. And whereas on the other hand, this one, initially their interpretation was obviously wrong. So it's not just the costs of shutting down the campus, it's also what the expectation is of this sort of event, that's an initial domestic violence one, then spilling out into a general spree. I didn't interpret the Virginia Tech explanation as saying we didn't take the initial shooting seriously. It's just they didn't think that the initial, shooting was then going to lead to a lot more shootings immediately thereafterwards.
Right. Well, but I mean, obviously, nobody expects 30 people to get shot. It did strike me that the tone of it was that, like, they seemed to be implying that had their impression been that the first two people were just random people killed, then there would have been some kind of panic, but that because they were reasonably confident that there was somehow a domestic violence incident to these initial murders, that they felt that that made other people safe. Which Garage was saying it's reasonably common for these kind of sprees to start out with something domestic in nature. And that, it does seem to be part of maybe a category on the part of law enforcement of not so much treating domestic violence issues less seriously than other kinds, but is treating them as sort of more distinct from like the underlying crime that it's not a murder, it's a domestic murder, so the rest of us can breathe safely.
Well, I think the problem is it depends how you look at it. If you're looking at it as how do you stop spree-style shootings, the problem might be that you, as you point out and Garance might point out, a lot of spree-type shootings originate from killing people at least initially, and then going on. The problem is that if you take a look at the overall universe of domestic violence cases,
there are
a very small percentage of those cases that take place then go on to spree-style shootings.
No, I mean, that's true. Generally, as I've been saying, I think there are so few kind of, mass murder incidents of this sort that it's really hard to reach any kind of conclusion about, about prevention. Other than, I'm not, like a gun controller myself. It is clearly true, I think, that if you had really, 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 really robust gun control, like in England, and that, essentially nobody owned guns of any kind, that would reduce the number of these incidents. Since that's not going to happen, I don't think even... I don't think the measures that people actually advocate for in the United States would make any kind of meaningful impact on this, just because it's so rare, so unpredictable, and I don't see how you can stop it.
Well, all right. I think we spent almost 20 minutes talking about something that we agree that really you can't do that much about. So we should probably move on to something we should, at least claim some merit.
Do we viciously disagree about Paul Wolfowitz?
Well, let me hear your take about Paul Wolfowitz and his plight at the bank. And let me put it this way: do you think that what's happening to Wolfowitz, is simply emblematic of what happens to all of these? Is it on parallel with what's happening to Gonzalez, or the fact that this administration seems relatively incompetent across a wide variety of policy measures?
In some ways, the Wolfowitz thing strikes me as a more banal instance of corruption that, Wolfowitz was put in a weird position, right? Just being given this job where it was known that his girlfriend, or I guess companion, I've seen her called in the newspapers, was working, and so she had to go to a different job, And then, naturally, right, there's a certain inclination to try and, misuse his authority and help her out. But the question is, why would you not misuse your authority in those circumstances? The reason you wouldn't is because, you feel like the other people you work for and so forth take this kind of thing really seriously. And I think the Bush administration in the whole, both in its conduct internally and in the way Wolfowitz wound up in that World Bank job, had just sort of really strongly signaled that, Wolfowitz was not going to get into any kind of trouble with the president, with anyone else, if he tried this sort of thing. That, there's real indifference to the World Bank as an institution, to corruption, that kind of thing.
I mean, I think I have more sympathy with Wolfowitz than certainly Gonzalez or any of the other sort of Brownie-style officials that the administration has come up with. Not necessarily to suggest that he should stay on. I think the problem is that Wolfowitz has managed to alienate both the bank staff and really powerful donors, and so therefore I don't think he's actually going to be able to do his job effectively.
Right.
And, what? Matt,
no, I mean, I agree.
Yeah, okay. But that said, here's my question. Let's just, the counterfactuals. Let's say that Bush, instead of appointing Paul Wolfowitz as head of the bank, had appointed, William Easterly, someone else who's something of a skeptic in terms of aid, but certainly recognized as an expert. He had a long career at the bank, and so on and so forth. And let's say Easterly had a girlfriend, in the exact same situation and gotten caught, pursued the exact same policies that Wolfowitz had done, and also been in the same sort of, slight problem in terms of his girlfriend. I don't think there would have been the same calls to resign. The fact is that there was incredibly bad blood about Wolfowitz from both European donors and the bank staff the moment he took this job.
Sure, but I think that bad blood was legitimate. And it was ridiculous to have appointed him to it in the first place. George Bush put Paul Wolfowitz in that job because Paul Wolfowitz was such a bad deputy defense secretary that he had to get him out of his administration. So given his record of failure in his alleged area of expertise, they put him in charge of an important institution that he has no expertise in because George Bush doesn't care about it. So, the donors and the staff had every reason to...
But I wouldn't go so far as to say he has no expertise, on development. He's been concerned about these issues for some time. Now, I grant you, the way in which they did this was just idiotic. They never vetted Wolfowitz. Traditionally, the Treasury Department, has the lead in terms of determining who the next World Bank president will be. And from what I remember, when this happened, Treasury was never consulted. So that was just an idiotic move. And it was, automatically 2 strikes against him the moment he went to the bank. So I grant you that. But on the other hand, I don't know, did you read the John Cassidy piece, the one in the New Yorker? It came out about, 2 or 3 weeks ago about Wolfowitz at the bank?
I think that was one of those pieces, I tell people I read, but I didn't. But it was brilliant. All New Yorker profiles. Brilliant.
Exactly, yeah. No, it's true. I got to read the Manny Ramirez one that's coming out, that's already out now. I actually did read the piece. The piece is, a reasonably even-handed, portrait of what Wolfowitz has done at the bank, where it's saying, there are reasons why he's pursuing this anti-corruption initiative.
Sure.
There's certainly valid reasons for doing it. The way he's gone about it has been somewhat ham-handed. And even this ethics charge in terms of his girlfriend, if you actually read what happens, the sort of chain of events, it's not like the bank board or the ethics committee comes off particularly well here either. Wolfowitz was very upfront at the beginning.
Right.
He originally proposed an arrangement where he would recuse himself from dealing with her in terms of either salary or promotion. And then the ethics, the bank board and the ethics staff said basically, no, that's not good enough. You need to get her out of here. And you go about figuring out how you're going to do that, which strikes me as a completely inane way of doing it.
I agree. Look, I don't think Paul Wolfowitz should be, locked up in Fort Leavenworth for what happened here. But, I think he should, I think you can, while sympathizing, especially with Wolfowitz, right, who one doesn't get the sense that any of this was his first choice, like that he was really agitating to be sent to the World Bank in order to arrange this job for his girlfriend, or anything like that.
It was clearly
right. Then still, if you get sent to the World Bank and see him, on first blush to like not be the best choice for it, and were chosen through a suspect process, then you come in, you do some, have a maybe defensible but controversial agenda that you're implementing in a somewhat ham-handed way, and that the content of that agenda is anti-corruption, and then you're caught up in some personal corruption. Even if being ham-handed isn't the worst thing, even if the corruption in question isn't the worst kind of corruption, even if not having been vetted properly isn't necessarily the worst thing, even if it was weird for the president to have picked someone who was guaranteed to piss off a lot of the donor community, at some point it's like, 12 strikes and you're out. I mean, and Paul Wolfowitz will be fine if he is forced out of the World Bank, right? I mean, it's not like he's going to end up, penniless on the streets or something.
Oh, no.
And so you put someone else in the job, the bank will probably be better off for it, and so will the world.
No, I mean, look, I tend to agree he's got to go, in part because I don't think he's got a political base in which he can run the place. And plus, yes, you're right. If you're going to run, look, if you're going to promote an anti-corruption campaign and then you're going to, you're being asked to deal with this, potential problem of nepotism, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, gee, this might come back to bite you in the ass. So, I agree that Wolfowitz has committed some problems. At the same time, even the African delegates came out in a statement saying, look, we actually like Wolfowitz. He's gotten us more money, which last I checked was one of the jobs the bank is supposed to be doing. So, I think the larger takeaway point I would take, I have some small measure of sympathy in wondering whether or not, in part, but Wolfowitz is complicit in this. In part, the Bush administration has committed so many, Category 5 clusterfucks that it's caused, even their officials, in other situations, when you have minor screw-ups, they get magnified way beyond belief. Now, they've brought this upon themselves. I agree with you on that.
Sure.
But there's a part of me that feels a little bit sympathetic to Wolfowitz on this point. I guess that's the way I would put it. And there have been previous blogging heads where, everyone sort of said, yeah, he should go. I guess I think he should go, too, but there's still a little part of me that's sympathetic to what he was trying to do, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know Wolfowitz per se. I do agree that in general, because there's a sort of love of narratives out there, and that because there's some examples of really, really clear examples of Bush administration incompetence, that there's people are eager to jump to the conclusion that everything that sort of happens there is like bungling rather than, possibly something that's not that big a deal, which I guess is what maybe you're saying about Wolfowitz, or else something that, whatever, then maybe incompetence isn't like the core of the problem you have here. For example, with Wolfowitz, I don't know much about, the relevant issues. Maybe Wolfowitz's anti-corruption agenda, is just a bad idea. He's wrong, and there's sincere disagreement between people, and that's part of why there's unhappiness about him. And I guess the Africa delegates say they did like him. And, it's always worth, looking at these things on the merits and not just sort of lazily assuming that because Katrina was such a clear, just sort of, management fiasco, that, that's every other complaint you have fits into that.
Yeah. On the other hand, on the other hand, as I said, they did bring this on themselves to some extent in terms of what, what Bush has done, during his first 6 years in office. So, and God knows Wolfowitz was complicit in that. So, there is a little bit of being hoisted on your own petard.
Right. They were operating under a cloud of suspicion for a reason.
Yeah, I think this way. The one closing note I would make on this is, as we go to 2008, I think part of the Bush administration's one of the real problems the Bush administration had when they initially came to power in 2001 was the belief that everything the Clinton administration had done prior to them was wrong and should be reversed. Not just in some cases for purely ideological reasons, in some cases for purely personal distaste. Now that turned out to be incredibly wrong. On a whole variety of ways, because in fact, the way, at least in terms of foreign policy, a lot of government, a lot of stuff is done. About 90% of what you're going to do in terms of foreign policy is not really going to change from administration to administration. And by trying to make these changes, there were some serious costs involved. That said, there's part of me that worries that, a Democratic president in 2009 is going to come to the exact same conclusion about the Bush administration's policies, across a whole wide variety of areas. And there's going to be some areas where clearly there should probably be some shifts, but there's probably going to be some areas where they actually did have the right idea. And I'm concerned that they might fall down, by the wayside in this sort of general conjecture of the Bush administration is incompetent.
Yeah, although, the incompetence notion has a special kind of valence to it that I think actually militates in the opposite direction, right? If you decide that what makes your predecessor so hard, because right, I think what creates this phenomenon is that, in Bush's case, right, he's running against Al Gore, and Al Gore is very clearly sort of Clinton's successor. And to a lot of people, the country seems fine in late 2000 or early 2001. Peace, prosperity, blah, blah, blah. So, you don't run against Gore and beat him unless you somehow psych yourself up into the belief that the administration you're displacing is, really bad in some sense. But so if what you can do, which I think is one of the things a lot of the Democrats are doing, is convince yourself that, what's so horrible about the people you're beating is just that they're incompetent, that opens up more room, I think in some ways more room than I would like, to decide that the other side's sort of basic policy aims are in fact fine and you want to do continuously, but just sort of bring in, better people to do them.
Mm-hmm. No,
right, as opposed to if you decide, right, that, the problem with Bill Clinton is that he's weak and indecisive, and so therefore anything you do will be an improvement as long as you decide on it really, really fast.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And partly to be fair, all administrations do this, particularly their first year of office. That the percentage of policy screw-ups that take place, I was just teaching my class about this, that takes place in the first year of office is tremendous. In large part because even people who are considered seasoned hands, once they take office, they think, they can just apply their prior experience. When in fact the world has changed a fair amount since the last time they were in office.
Right.
And they're inevitably, their own hubris is going to lead to certain kinds of mistakes.
Right. I think this is, not to say this in too much of a partisan axe-grinding vein, but I think if you look back at some of the sort of Richard Clark stuff, 9/11 Commission stuff that, came out at this kind of unfortunate moment in the heat of the presidential campaign, but in a kind of understandable but also obviously unfortunate light of what happened way, new people come over, they think of themselves as seasoned experts. There are these kind of mid-level holdovers from the Clinton administration who are like, oh, hey, Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, you got to do something about this. And their instinct is to just be suspicious of that. Because, that's not what they were doing the last time they were in government. They don't know who these other people are, why it is that they have this, weird obsession that's, the other guy's issue. And so at the margin, when what you really ought to do is at the margin correct against your own bias. Yeah. To ignore new things. You do go the reverse because you suspect the motives of the people who are trying to, get you up to speed on what's been happening most recently.
Mm-hmm. No. And this Clark in particular is a great example of this because, Clark's reputation in Washington when the Bush people came in was as a master bureaucratic operator who liked accumulating power unto himself. He might have been he was absolutely right, as it turned out, on the issue. But the problem is that if you're Condi Rice or whatever, and you see this person saying, I need to maintain, my status as being a policy principal on this issue, there's a natural, hesitance to this sort of thing, that unfortunately leads to a bad policy outcome, but is also justifiable, I guess, would be the way to, without the hindsight bias.
Right, or at least, it's, I don't know. It seems endemic to the way the American government operates.
Yeah,
and it's not really the best feature of it.
No, it's true. I'm not sure there's any way to fix it. Unless you have, more people transitioning from administration to administration across party lines. This is just something that's going to be a function of the way the current system
Right,
works.
no, exactly. But, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think political appointees in America go sort of deeper into the agencies than they do in most countries, right?
Yeah, and it's also been on the increase. The Reagan administration in particular was sort of the ones who pioneered this idea as a way to make sure that what Reagan, wanted done actually got implemented.
Right, but so like in England, I mean, obviously after an election, if there's a partisan switch, there'll be like a total turnover in the cabinet. But that turnover only goes like a couple people deep into every.
That's correct. Yeah.
Into every agency, whereas in America it can go like 7, 8 down.
No, not 7. I mean, it's not 7 or 8 down. It'll go down usually to what's there's the cabinet level. There's deputy. There are undersecretaries, assistants. I guess it's 5. Yeah, a deputy assistant secretary is usually the level at which it'll stop.
Right. Well, and then but I mean, then a lot of powers in the sort of the White House staff.
Yeah, that's true, and that is a complete turnover.
Right, and the White House staff is huge, much bigger than like a prime minister's office. I mean, it's a bigger country too. Yeah. So I don't know.
No. This is I mean, no, you're right. It's an interesting issue. On the other hand, there are limitations to the European system as well.
Right. I mean, there's reasons we do it this way, and Ronald Reagan. I mean, I'm not a huge Ronald Reagan fan, but the impulse to say that he wanted the government to, implement the policies he'd been elected to implement, rather than pursue their own agenda, seems perfectly justifiable.
Yeah. Although you can argue, I mean, I think this is another sort of tension that we're seeing with the debate about the U.S. attorneys, is this question within the United States of to what extent should, a government bureaucracy operate according to professional norms as opposed to political dictates?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is, it's the, I don't know, I always think it's notable if you just talk to, like, read English newspapers or whatever, so stuff about England, right, that the, sort of the word the government and the word the state have very, clear and distinct meanings there. That the government is a small number of politicians who will be put in charge of the state, but that the state, is a collection of agencies and bureaucrats that sort of has a logic of its own. And in America, for a variety of reasons, that gets pretty murky. I mean, the U.S. attorneys are pretty deep in the trenches, in sort of like the bowels of the federal apparatus, to be direct presidential appointees.
Well, it seems to me they are presidential appointees, and also. I mean,
I mean, they are, but I mean, I think it's weird that they are.
Oh, I see.
They have, it seems, just like it would be weird if the president was picking the heads of all the local FBI field offices, out of, and like taking advice from his campaign contributors in the city where he was going to do it, and so on and so forth. Bush appears, I think, quite clearly to have been, in this case, sort of taken the logic of having these people be political appointees to a place where it hasn't traditionally been taken.
No, that's a fair statement, yeah.
But the logic of what he did really is, as I guess, because it doesn't defend him all that effectively, they haven't been willing to just say, like, well, look, if you didn't want these offices to be abused, you shouldn't have made them presidential appointments in the first place. But, I find that defense semi-convincing, not in the sense that the offices should be abused, but that, like, maybe this needs to be a little bit more, bureaucratized.
Well, in some ways, though, I think it was bureaucratized. I mean, I think one of the ironies of this whole scandal is that, it was the Bush appointees, because they were considered, because they were professional lawyers, and because they were professional prosecutors, they wound up not implementing what Bush wanted them to in terms of, sort of partisan politics, focusing overwhelmingly on voter fraud, even if there was no evidence necessarily that voter fraud took place, for example. So I actually think this shows the limitations of the sort of the Bush approach or the American approach of trying to, go incredibly deep in terms of appointing political staff, because at a certain level, you hit there's a clash between political priorities and professionalization.
Right.
And, it doesn't matter which administration is in power in this sense. Partisan.
I mean, I was joking with a friend last night that the lesson here seems to be that the Edwards administration needs to be really, really, really careful when screening its U.S. attorney appointments to make sure that they will manipulate the office for partisan purposes, up front.
No, you're right, yeah.
Because obviously you can't fire them in the back end, which it's a joke because like the issue here is not the firing per se, but like the politicization of the prosecutorial function, unfortunately, hanging Alberto Gonzalez, though something that I think should be done, especially since he like stuff he did with Congress, blah blah blah, doesn't quite like get at the nub of the concern here, which is that you will have prosecutors acting on behalf of partisan imperatives rather than even policy ones.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's one thing to say, okay, the new administration judges, we need less sort of high-end fraud enforcement and more, more like election law stuff.
Right.
Okay, I don't know. New
there was a great piece that Jack Goldsmith and Dahlia Lithwick wrote for Slate when this scandal initially broke that sort of got at the distinction between, on the one hand, it's perfectly appropriate for presidents to set priorities in terms of prosecution,
right.
but the actual determining of what cases should be brought forward, so on and so forth, should be, a professional determination and not a political one.
Right. Well, and also, I mean, the priority can be we need to do more public corruption stuff. The priority can't be we need to do more public corruption stuff against Democrats.
Right. No, I completely agree on this. I mean, otherwise, and I think one of the ironies of this is going to be, again, looking into 2009, there's going to be, I think it's going to be the same thing that happened, after the Nixon administration left office, which is Nixon so politicized so many of the different, functions of government, getting the FBI to engage in domestic surveillance, that sort of thing. I think you're going to see a similar kind of backlash where presidents are actually going to be relatively restricted in terms of what they are going to be expected to, in terms of running up against professional norms. And it'll be interesting. I think one of the interesting sort of undercurrents in the campaign going forward is going to be how the Democratic candidates react to this. Because on the one hand, they obviously want the job, and the way to get the job as president is to bash Bush. On the other hand, once they get the job, they want all the perquisites that come with the job.
Right.
And paradoxically, Bush is by screwing up so badly, is stripping them away one by one.
Right. Although, I mean, Democrats have less distrust of sort of the permanent bureaucracy than Republicans do.
That's probably true. I mean, on the other hand, though, I think there was an item in the plank that Michael Crowley wrote about the Clinton campaign and how it looked at campaign contributions by former Clintonistas to, say, Obama or other people. And, it sounded, you could have replaced the word Clinton with Bush, and it would have had that same kind of vengeful attitude.
Right. Well, except, I mean, what they were talking about there was like an intra-partisan, right, donors type thing.
That's true, but the point is that if it's the same kind of mindset in terms of, there's friends and there's enemies, and we're going to go after the enemies as much as possible, this makes me very nervous about a President Hillary Clinton.
Oh yeah, well that's. I mean, I'm not going to be voting for her.
Yeah.
I mean, I also thought this is weird. It's along the lines of what you said, but one of the various explanations her campaign has put out for why she was supporting the Iraq authorizing resolution was that she had sort of saw things from the White House point of view
right.
and wanted presidents to be able to have that kind of authority if they asked for it.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is you sort of expect anyone, the longer they spend in the White House, to gain greater and greater appreciation for the virtues of executive power. The idea of someone who comes in sort of with the, this is my 9th year in the White House kind of view about, how expansive her powers need to be, does seem a little bit distressing.
Yeah.
Although on the other hand, Congress is probably going to be much more active about this kind of stuff in the near future for sort of Nixon type reasons, as you said.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's for institutional prerogatives. Well, that'll be interesting going forward. We should probably move on.
Oh right. Yeah.
Yeah. We're running a little over. That was a fun conversation.
It was.
Okay,
Speaking of Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. Okay, we were going to be talking about books.
Yes.
I have one out called All Politics is Global, and, I have a vested interest in not needlessly annoying, regular watchers of Blogging Heads TV who've seen me pump this book, pimp the book, whatever you want to call it, the last couple of times. So let's start off by talking about your book, which you're working on right now, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I've sent off the first draft to my editor. We've got some
excellent.
notes back and forth, juice is flowing. Our working title is The Untitled Matthew Yglesias Foreign Policy Project, which is also going to be the name of my prog rock band.
I was going to say, that does sound like a band name. Yeah.
I know, and it's a
good company.
Yeah, it's a pretty awesome one, right? Or also, like sketch comedy satire or something.
Right.
Yeah, so probably we'll get a title at some point. And this book is sort of a political history of the past few years, looking at the politics of national security in particular, sort of mostly looking at the kind of rise of the sort of liberal hawk movement in the media and its influence inside the Democratic Party, and critique of that, both of the politics and the substance of that kind of thing. To tie back to some of our earlier conversations, I mean, in particular, I worry that a lot of Democrats, not so much Democratic-based people, but Democratic politicians and people who'd be running this kind of thing have reached the conclusion that the problem with George W. Bush's post-9/11 foreign policy has been that it's been incompetently executed, rather than that there are some actual errors that were made in terms of, strategic priorities, what's important, what isn't, so on and so forth. And that, this is a mistake, that it's not all that politically compelling, but more relevantly, certainly for our purposes, it's just wrong. It's a mistake to accept a lot of the strategic premises, notwithstanding the question of competence.
Well, let me push you a little bit on this, because I mean, I think you need to separate the larger questions about Bush foreign policy, and then there's Iraq, which admittedly is a large component of this. I mean, I'd be happy to debate you on the Iraq one, because, I do still think the implementation mattered there, because if you look at the history of it, it was so catastrophically bad.
Sure, but I even mean, it's worth, obviously, abstracting from Iraq to some extent, because, nobody's going to invade Iraq a second time.
Right. But, all right, so if you're talking about the policy writ large, really, on the one hand, liberal hawks supported Iraq and they supported the war on terror, but were liberal hawks really behind, the entire gamut of Bush foreign policy, the whole gamut of Bush foreign policy approaches? I just left I was involved somewhat marginally in this Princeton project on national security.
Sure. That
Anne-Marie Slaughter and John Eikenberry have led, which I would assume they would fall under the liberal hawk argument that you're making. But, their emphasis is much more, there's much more multilateralism in what they're talking about. They want to create this concert of democracies, so on and so forth. So there was a lot they also disagreed with in terms of the Bush administration. But so is it the areas of agreement that still disturb you, or are you?
Well, okay, so I think the Princeton Project is a pretty good thing that I approve of large parts of it, and it sort of well encapsulates where I think the Democrats are vis-a-vis this argument, which is to say, in an ambiguous position. That a lot of the things that, for like the slogan of the Princeton Project, "A world of liberty under law," seems like a great slogan to me. Not just as a slogan, but like it encapsulates what you need to do. Yeah. But that at other points, it just appears to me to give way too much ground to the conceit that somehow the primary source of problems in the world is that the UN is like preventing the United States from launching all the wars we need, and so that we should have a community of democracies that can sort of alternatively authorize this stuff. I know Bob has been on to debate this before, but that this, to me, it's wrong substantively, and also I think it's pretty transparent that this is like a kind of liberal internationalist effort to kind of Me Too neoconservatism and say, oh yeah, democracy's great, but so's multilateralism. So here's our multilateral democracy club. And that then, like, why exactly there should be a multilateral democracy club is not being well worked out. Now, I don't particularly fear the community of democracies concept because I think nobody else is going to sign up
Well, concert of the community of democracies was tried.
Right,
as an
right.
abject. You mean concert? Yeah, concert.
Right. The concert of democracy's idea, as outlined in that report, is just a non-starter. So it's sort of neither here nor there. But the thinking behind it seems confused and sort of ambiguous to me. That it doesn't. That like there were. I think most of the neoconservative criticisms you could make of that idea would be true, and then like also criticisms from the other end.
Right.
That it's just this kind of, it's this halfway house that's been adopted to sort of avoid, confronting the issues squarely.
I think there are two issues that come up here. The first is whether or not it's a decent policy idea, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I'm curious whether your book also talks about the fact that I think politically the Princeton Project proposals are probably going to be a non-starter. In part because you're talking about the rise of liberal hawks. It's really about the rise and fall of liberal hawks, I think.
Right. Politically.
Almost personified by Peter Beinart to some extent.
Yes. No.
And I got at this to some extent in a piece I wrote for the Washington Post back in December that sort of surveyed the possible grand strategies out there. And one of the conclusions I drew was that actually the grand strategy that will probably be the one favored by whoever comes into power is going to be one, the ethical realism one that Anatol Lieven and John Holtzman put forward, largely because it's the one that requires the least amount of effort in terms of overseas, that it actually involves a retrenchment of, to some extent, of U.S. power, which is basically what Americans want at this point.
Right, although I'm not... I guess I agree with most of what you said, except for your confidence that that's necessarily the direction things are headed in. I mean, I think that the influence of public opinion on, policy outcomes, especially in this area, gets pretty attenuated, and that...
Yes, absolutely, that's true.
And so that... so you see, for example, just Hillary Clinton's campaign right now, appears to be the favorite to win the Democratic nomination. I think if she becomes the nominee, the odds favor her winning. And I think that her rhetoric has certainly shifted to more sort of what the voters want to hear about this kind of thing, because, she's not like an incompetent politician. But that her... sort of, I think, her personal instincts and those of the people she would try and put into office is not that the voters correctly think we need some measure of retrenchment from the grandiose goals of the Bush administration, but that what they think is that you need just put smarter people in charge of those grandiose goals.
My take is slightly different. I mean, you're correct that sort of historically... There's been a long, there's a divorce between what the public wants in terms of foreign policy and what elites, want, and what foreign policy actually looks like. And Benjamin Page has a whole book on this point called The Foreign Policy Disconnect. The thing I would point out, however, and suggest is that because of Iraq, I think we're actually in an exceptional period on this point. I think you can point to the 2006 election, and I think you're going to see it come up in the next election as well, which is because Iraq is so paramount in people's minds when we, think about what the issues are, in the next campaign. Candidates are going to be held, their feet are going to be held to the fire much more so than in the post-Cold War elections of recent years about what their foreign policy, positions are going to be.
Right.
And so I think this is a case where what they say during the campaign really actually will, affect what they're going to do in terms of policy. And I think the things that are going to resonate during the campaign are proposals that basically say the U.S. the U.S. no longer needs to be the world's policeman. It breeds resentment elsewhere. We need to stay actively involved in world affairs. We have to do our share. But, we need to cut a slightly lower profile because this is what America wants and this is what the rest of the world wants. In fact, there was a poll that just came out today on this point.
Right.
I don't know if, I think that World Public Opinion did. Yeah, the PIPA and World Public Opinion did, saying this is what, Americans and everyone else wants. So
right. Well, I that's more or less what I want, and I certainly, I hope with the book when it comes out, and on my blog and whatever else day to day to help perhaps spur those changes. I mean, I guess I'm not
You're
sure
a change agent. I like it.
If I thought what you thought that would be an optimistic point of view from my perspective. I mean, I found it noteworthy, though, that, so far in the campaign, the candidates have all, I think, tried very hard to sort of, get on the right side of public sentiment about this kind of thing, but have also, mostly by kind of avoiding the issue. So that, like John Edwards, right, who's famously, endeared himself to the hearts of the left for a variety of reasons, but to do that, he had to disavow his Iraq War vote. But if you read his op-ed in which he did that, and if you read, his speeches, his words on it, he's very specifically making a point about the quality of the intelligence that he had.
Right.
He's not making a point about the wisdom of unilateral preventative military action as an approach to nonproliferation policy.
Well, this actually, I think, ties back into our initial, what we were talking about before, which is the difference between what presidential candidates have to do or say to get elected, and then what presidential candidates, the prerogatives of power they want once they come into office.
Right.
Which is, so, we've nicely tied this back to our initial point. I mean, you're right. Part of this is that no president wants to say, no candidate wants to lock themselves in a position that therefore constrains them overly, too much once they come into office.
Right. No. I mean, exactly. But I mean, so I would hope that our activists and so forth, will sort of do their part to try and make people do what they're disinclined to do.
Well, this will be an interesting tension, I think, as the campaign goes forward. So I agree with you on that. When is your book supposed to come out? I'm just curious.
It's a little up in the air at the moment.
Okay.
We'll see.
I assume you want to come out before the 2008 election, though.
Yeah, no, that would be the goal. I don't really want to try and negotiate via Blogging Head segment though.
Fair enough.
I think that it might get inappropriate. But yeah, so all politics is global.
As I said,
have you seen that giant parking structure near the Alewife Tea Stop that Tip O'Neill had built?
Yes.
That shows that all politics is local.
All politics. Oh, yes. No, well, I mean, that's the play on the. That's obviously the play on the title, but
right.
The arguments I'm making in the book actually are, to some extent, the arguments I make in the book in terms of what we were just talking about is that the fact is, in a world where increasingly, even though we might want to retrench a little bit, there's an increasing number of issues that have to be dealt with at the global level. And, the U.S., it's obviously in the U.S.'s interest to throw its weight around. And to some extent that's a good thing because, to some extent the argument I make in the book is that market power matters. So basically you're going to have, effective global governance if you can get the U.S. and the EU to agree on things. That was the point I made in the book. But, going forward, I'm a little more skeptical in part because, during the period that I studied, it was a nice bipolar distribution of power between the U.S. and the EU, whereas going forward, you're going to have India, you're going to have China, you're going to have more and more states. It becomes a more multipolar world. And interestingly enough, one of the problems is that, multilateralists like Eichenberry and Slaughter in the Princeton Project want to see this, increasing number of multilateral institutions. And one of the things I'm going to argue going forward is that, in fact, an increasing number of multilateral institutions isn't necessarily going to lead to more of a rule-based world.
Right. It dilutes the ruliness of the rules.
Say that again. The what?
It makes the rules less like real rules.
It makes the rules less like it makes it possible to form shop among the different rules.
Right.
And so it becomes ever more confusing, which takes place at the domestic level as well. Except in the domestic level, you have administrative courts and other procedures to sort of eventually, adjudicate between them. Whereas at the global level, you don't. And so,
No, right. I agree with that.
Right, and this is part of the problem I have with Bob Wright's proposals, about sort of larding the WTO with more and more rules. I don't think, first of all, it's never going to happen because the WTO, because a majority of countries in the WTO are going to oppose it for a variety of reasons. What this is leading, incidentally, is to the United States and the European Union actually trying to get these rules implemented at the bilateral level. And sort of regional trade agreements. But this actually leads to an erosion, potentially, over time of what the WTO can do. And so it's very, there's very complicated effects here, and I'm not sure, I need to, this is sort of also going to be the subject of the next book for me as well. What happens when you try to create sort of a new, set of institutions, overlapping a whole set of old pre-existing institutions that are perceived to be somewhat dysfunctional?
Yes. That's a good question.
Right. But that's going forward.
And a difficult one. I guess. No, I think that's true, and I mean, especially get something I guess I feel a little bit better informed about. But yeah, that the impulse by multilateralists. One of the things you see from a lot of people is the idea that, well, if international institutions are good, then more institutions must be better.
Right.
Which I don't think is correct. I mean,
no,
it doesn't.
It's not necessarily true. What you want are coherent.
I mean, it stems from a lack of understanding of why institutions might be good.
Yeah. No, that's largely correct. I mean, but there's paradoxical effects, unfortunately, because from a U.S. perspective, sometimes you want to create new regimes because it actually allows you to advance your interests.
Right.
The interesting question is going to be over the long haul what the effects of this are. And this gets back to the concert of democracies idea that's being put forward. Let's assume for the moment you could actually do that. The problem, of course, is that countries like China are then going to respond by creating concerts of non-democracies.
Right. Right. No. I mean, this is what I remember a kind of incident when I got to talk to John and Marie about this, and Anatol Lieven was saying in a very agitated way to them, like, why did they want to start a Cold War with a Russia-China bloc?
Yeah.
And they were sort of denying that's what they wanted to do. And I mean, I guess it's not. I guess it's not what they want to do, but that's what.
But
would
it could
happen.
be what actually happened. No, I agree. This is the interesting thing. I think the only way you can actually counteract that. There might be a way to counteract it, but the way to counteract it is, again, a weird thing where I think you would actually have to create more institutions, which is, if you create a concert of democracies, but you also create a new institution that allows for, let's say, a new version of the G7 or G8 that basically brings China in, and brings other non-democracies but powerful states, in terms of the economy, and bring those into a new club. I mean, the G20 is what, not
right.
Ethiopia,
No,
G20,
right.
But, yeah.
I mean, specifically, it seemed to me like the red line in the concept of democracies as they outlined it was that there's something in that report about how, if the Security Council doesn't adopt X, Y, and Z reforms, that they want to say that the concept of democracies can, authorize the use of force in the spirit of the UN Charter or something. And to me, I mean, I think that's obviously a non-starter. That you're better off if you want to use force without Security Council authorization, just doing it.
Well, I have to disagree.
It's
with
really
that.
pressing than to. I think that to try and say that you're formally institutionalizing an alternative source of authority that is explicitly designed to exclude China and Russia.
Isn't that NATO?
Well, I don't think it is. I mean, I don't think NATO, NATO doesn't say in its charter, we can just attack other countries, and that's international law.
No, it doesn't, but I don't think the concert of democracies would necessarily say that in their charter either. No one would be so stupid as to be that explicit.
Right, sure. I guess to say, with NATO, right, I think it was relevant that, NATO's big actions all happened in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
To, why it worked. Not explicitly, right, but implicitly, there was something of a, this is our corner.
Right.
Kind of attitude to it. And also Russia, Russia was also just really, really weak back then, and one could afford to completely ignore what they thought. In a way,
and even then, they sent paratroopers to Pristina after the operation took place.
No, it didn't go smoothly. But, Russia's recovered economically. They have all this oil, blah, blah, blah. Pragmatically, it has to be, dealt with a little more seriously than it did in 1998, which was sort of the nadir of Russian influence in the world.
No, it'll be an interesting question going forward.
Right.
Unfortunately, I think we got to wrap up now.
Sure, yes.
And I'm sorry to cut it off like that, but I know we were supposed to upload this relatively quickly. But
no, you're right.
Very pleasant conversation.
Yes, thank you.
And good luck with the book.
Thank you.
All right, take care.